Welcome to everybody. Many thanks for coming here on time. We are going to start with a couple of minutes of delay. After all, after the fire alarm in the UM, we have to keep it on time. We'll finish at 2:45 this meeting. I'm Massimo Tomasoli, and I'm the permanent observer for international IDEA to the UN. And I'm very proud, also on behalf of the other co-hosts of this meeting, to introduce to you this distinguished panel composed by the permanent representative of Peru to the UN, His Excellency Ambassador Gustavo Mesa Quadra, and the Director General of the International Development Law Organization, Mrs. Irene Khan, the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Martin Chungong, and right to my left, the member of the Board of Advisors of International IDEA, Mrs. Emine Boskurt. In the note that has been distributed, there are also some notes on the bios of the panelists, although I think that they do not need much introduction because they are quite famous and well known. Just a couple of words on the topic that we have picked for this event, which is democratic accountability for gender equality in service delivery and poverty eradication. It is very important at the time of the review during the high-level political forum to focus on the goals selected for this year, and the SDG 5 on gender equality is one of them. But I would like to underscore also the importance of gender equality as a goal in itself, but also as an enabler and as an accelerator for the achievement of the other goals, not only those that are included in the review this year, that is poverty, hunger, health, and the oceans and the seas and infrastructures, but I think also for the agenda as a whole. And we will hear of these from our speakers more in detail, I would say from the point of view of defining regulatory and normative frameworks for gender parity and gender accountability, the definition of appropriate policies for decent work, for service delivery that is really accountable in a gender perspective, the definition of tools for monitoring progress, and therefore the issue of accountability in a data perspective. All of these will be touched upon from different angles by our panelists. But without further ado, I give the floor to Ambassador Gustavo Mesa Quadra, Permanent Representative of Peru to the UN.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Massimo. In the Peruvian capacity as current President of International IDEA, I would like to welcome you all to this important event. And thanks Massimo Tomasioli and his team for organizing this side event on such an interesting aspect of the 2030 Agenda, accountability for gender equality in service delivery and poverty eradication. I will constrain these introductory remarks to 3 points, looking forward to hear more from our distinguished panel. My first comment is one of normative nature. As defined by the 2030 Agenda, the SDGs are interlinked and indivisible. It is therefore quite relevant and useful to further work in interlinkages between the 3 goals addressed in this event: SDG 1, poverty; SDG 5, women; and SDG 16, justice. The first 2 are actually being reviewed in a more profound manner this year at the HLPF, and they are the only ones to which the agenda acknowledges a cross-cutting status. Indeed, the first paragraph of the 2030 Agenda's preamble recognizes that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. And paragraph 20 of its declaration states that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will make a crucial contribution to progress across all the goals and targets. SDG 16 promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels, is meant to receive the same attention as SDG 2 only in 2019. However, when we look at the VNR presentations and at the focus of a large number of side events, we see that mostly everyone is talking about the institutional challenges faced for achieving all the other SDGs. During the final phase of the SDGs negotiation, Peru had the honor to facilitate the final compromise on what ended up being Goal 16. Comparing the discussions held with the challenges posed by today's realities, it's clear that SDG 16 is deeply interlinked with all other SDGs and that we could have been more ambitious and focus on good governance and accountable institutions at all levels. This led me to a second comment, which is of a more factual nature. The 2030 Agenda, to become real for those who most need it, is meant to be domesticated from the very local level, taking into account different circumstances, needs, and priorities. Its implementation depends on a bottom-up process requiring a widespread participation of citizens along with all relevant stakeholders. This implies very contingent, rarely straightforward political processes. Governments are, of course, accountable for service delivery, but what is actually demanded from their citizens can vary quite significantly in such processes. And the normative provided by the UN cannot be considered neutral in any given context. The 2030 Agenda is, of course, a transformative one, and we are observing a number of setbacks that doesn't necessarily reflect rational approaches to the challenges shared by humanity. Politics matter if we are to achieve the SDGs. My third and final point is rather political. For the political dimensions of service delivery are particularly critical for tackling inequalities. The rule of law can certainly be of a powerful tool for ensuring equal opportunities, but the rule of law can also serve the interest of an unequal status quo. Of course, the status quo within and amongst nations tends to be unequal. Indeed, inequality has been increasing in the last decades, leading to responses based on anger more than in reason, and thus SDG 10 can also be seen as a cross-cutting one. The 2030 Agenda, by looking at poverty as a multidimensional phenomenon, seeking to address its roots, causes, and deliver a structural transformation, tackling inequalities, should be the right antidote with the right normative. But have no doubts, its implementation is a political endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mesa Quadra. The interlinkages across the 2030 Agenda are extremely important. Also, SDG 16 has been identified both as a goal and as an enabler, as we said about SDG 5. So I can see there already a very interesting emphasis on implementation, on monitoring, on actually being consistent with the broad thrust of the agenda. Let's now move on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Irene Khan, Director General of the International Development Law Organization. And I think you may use these Microphone over there. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking International IDEA and the Interparliamentary Union and the representative of Peru for having organized this event together with us. It is a curious event in the UN system, just across the road from the UN, to have 3 organizations independent of the UN, but partnering with the UN as raising this issue here, which I think is an indication that the SDGs are about partnerships, reaching out to and working in innovative ways, in the non-traditional ways, out-of-the-box ways. And there isn't an issue that is more out of the box than how do we finally address the issue of gender equality. We are in the 21st century, and in the 21st century, we are still talking about gender equality. This should have been resolved about 100 years ago, but it hasn't. Now, and of course, we know how important it is. The discussion was, in the opening remarks, it was noted that there is a relationship between SDG 1 and SDG 5 and SDG 16, and of course with other SDGs, SDG 10, for example, on equality. So this is the challenge that we have with the 2030 agenda, the interlocking, interrelated relationship. And very few issues are as important to that relationship as accountability and equality, and gender equality being at the forefront of it. And why? I mean, we know that there were certain gains made under the MDGs that were relevant to women and girls and to gender issues, but we did not crack the fundamental concept of inequality, because the context and the systems and the institutions that underlie inequality were ignored. Now, for me, one piece of data that has intrigued me has been that in the United States, the figures for maternal mortality began to come down dramatically with the first Congress in which women were allowed to participate. That is a fact. That shows that political power actually affected how budgets were made, where was money spent in public health, and led to a fall in the number of women who were dying in childbirth or pregnancy-related reasons. A very clear correlation between political power and social development. But what do we see here now? Of course, there have been and we have to admit there has been some progress made on issues of women's health and food security and so on, but we still have dramatic figures that an estimated something like 60% of the undernourished people in the world are women and girls. That's a horrific figure to think about it, that young women between the age of 15 and 24 have a 50% higher chance of being infected with HIV. And 35% of the women, if I was to ask every third woman in this room to stand up, that's the ratio of sexual and gender-based violence still. So these are horrific figures with which we are beginning our discussion and entering the 2030, the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Take the other side then. So when we talk about democratic accountability, let's begin with the crude figures of what happens in parliaments, and we find that parliamentary representation of women in parliaments have gone from 11% 20 years ago to 22%. So it's taken us 20 years to make that slight improvement, but there are still 38 states in which women have less than 10% parliamentarians, 4 chambers with no women at all. And Rwanda, with 63%, is not the norm. It's the exception. And then if you look at the executive branch, the numbers are probably even worse. The judicial branch, which my organization, the International Development Law Organization, works very often, is equally poor. with only 27% global figures, 27% of judges being women, 25% of prosecutors, and only 9% in the police force. So if we work at this current rate, then political parity will not be reached until 2080. So way beyond the end of the agenda, the calendar of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now we know when we look at data, as I mentioned, of the US Congress and maternal mortality, and there are many, many figures now that are emerging from all countries in the world, gender equality is not only an issue, is not only fair, but it's also smart policy. But I would then say, so how do we get there? And getting there, I would say, first of all, recognizing that parliamentary representation is only one form of democratic accountability. And in fact, it is in many ways, for ordinary people, it is probably the least relevant. Because yes, you vote once every so many years, you throw your ballot in the box, and then you don't know what parliaments are doing. What's very important is to look at democracy on the ground. And that means participation, that means engagement, and that means empowerment. And that is where I think SDG 16 becomes incredibly important in terms of delivering the other SDGs. Because SDG 16 opens the path for institutional change, but also for empowerment of people. And empowerment of women and girls, we have found, is the single most effective way of engaging and introducing accountability. And in my organization, of course, we are engaged in the area of legal empowerment. It starts with looking at laws and ensuring that they have a adequate gender perspective in it. And there are still many, many laws that do not ensure, not only do they fail to ensure gender equality, they actively discriminate against women. And so SDG 5.1 is extremely important. IDLO has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with UN Women, and we are working together with UN Women, ourselves, UNODC, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office to identify laws and policies that need to be changed. So this whole issue of legal laws do not automatically bring about change, but they are a very important signal, policy signal, about what is not right. And therefore, it is important to look at the issue of laws. The second issue I would say is, of course, laws also create a framework for women to claim rights. And the third point I would want to push here is political and legal identity. Legal identity is an issue that is in SDG 16, and it is incredibly important right throughout. If you want to participate, if you want to be part of society, you have to have legal identity. And many women do not have that. Women are not registered necessarily. They don't have identity papers. And in many countries, indigenous communities and others, entire communities are excluded. And within those communities, women are found to be even doubly discriminated. And we have, as IDLO, we have worked, for example, in Morocco, which is, in a traditional society, traditional Muslim society, what we were looking at were children who were born out of wedlock, where the mother could not get identity papers for the baby. And how do you empower the mother, who is under some social stigma for having given birth outside wedlock? How do you empower her, and how do you get the institutions, the local institutions, to respect her and deal with her with respect? And when I say deal with her with respect, I mean a simple issue of walking in and demanding a paper, and then getting the identity papers for the child so that the child can then have access to health, inoculations, schooling, and so many other things. So this whole issue of identity is, again, critical that comes up. Now, of course, laws do not implement themselves automatically, so there is a whole issue of regulation and policy that one has to look at. And in all these situations, the engagement of women, how do you get them engaged? Now, I mentioned laws. There is something that is somewhere kind of forgotten in the 2030 agenda, and that there is a whole legal system that doesn't exist in the formal ways through formal institutions. It is actually informal. And women are very often affected by those informal justice systems. Let me give you an example of a project that we have in Burundi, where we are looking at a massive program by the government to register land. And of course, in the context of registration of land, what has been forgotten is that women in Burundi very often have informal rights to land. They can access land, they can use it, they can farm it, but they do not own it. So when ownership is registered, their ability to use is being forgotten. So they are just losing it, and they themselves are not aware of their rights. And this brings me to the point that I was making about legal empowerment, making women and girls aware of their rights so that they can claim it, they can engage in the process. And in the context of Burundi, we are working at the level of communities, bringing community leaders, women's groups together to discuss this issue and to see how they can resolve and ensure women's access to land is still preserved. In Uganda and in Tanzania, we have just launched a project that is empowering young women and adolescent girls to hold health organizations legally, through legal empowerment and social accountability methods, to hold the service providers in health responsible. Basically, these women, young women, are being made aware of their rights to claim it, to protect themselves, because they're at a high risk of HIV infection. So it's basically teaching young women and girls that they have a right to say no to unprotected sex. So as simple as that, making them confident enough to be able to seek that assistance they need and to be able to deal with those issues. So when we talk about SDG 16 and SDG 5 and SDG 1, we're talking about basic stuff about how do you empower women to participate and claim their rights as citizens. That, to me, is a much more powerful form of democracy. Far removed, perhaps, from parliaments and parliamentarians and elections, but democracy happening on the ground. Let me just mention one other issue, that very often when we're talking about integration of rights, but we need to talk about integration of strategies and policies on the ground too. One good example is a program in Afghanistan that we have been running, looking at gender-based violence and how you address it. One component of it deals with institutions, where we are training prosecutors to deal with gender-based violence, prosecutors and courts. There is another component where it looks at women's shelter. And there is a shelter network that we are facilitating in Afghanistan to actually give women shelter, women fleeing domestic violence. And the third component is legal aid networks, so women can access legal aid. And a fourth component is about public awareness. So if you put those four components together, you actually find that law is one element, a very important element. Courts and institutions play a role, but so does social mobilization to provide networks, and so does the awareness that women have and access to justice in proper ways. And it is in that kind of practical ways that change is coming on the ground, and conceptually, that's what the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs are doing. They're giving us elements of democratic accountability and of ways of empowering citizens, especially in this case women, to be able to access the rights and the services that they need. An important part of all this, of course, is innovation. We have to be creative. There are many, many ways. Law is a tool to enable behavioral change, but it is not the end of it. One needs to be very acutely aware of situations on the ground. No one country is like another. And finally, I would make a point, is that when we are talking about democratic accountability, we need to be very aware of community power structures, especially when it comes to talking about gender equality in access to services. Recognizing what's happening in the community needs to be on top of policymakers' agenda, because if you have male-dominated community structures and not recognizing power, this is about power, and accountability is about holding power to account. We are talking about political power, but there is also social power. That means an acute awareness of the dynamics on the ground, so that through shifting, we can shift things only through that awareness. I'm going to stop here because I've probably spoken way beyond my allotted time, but I do think it's important for us to recognize the interrelationship, to recognize the concept of accountability in an integrated agenda has itself to be multifaceted. And democracy means actually democracy at the grassroots as much as at the higher levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for a very rich presentation, very important remarks about partnerships, which I would say are shown here as part of a process. These institutions, the IPU, IDLO, International IDEA, partnered actually in order to advocate a strong accountability dimension in the 2030 agenda. We did it with our member states. Peru is chairing IDEA's council now, but other members of IDEA, members of IDLO, all the, I would say, the constituency, the important constituency of the parliaments of the world in the IPU contributed to seeing accountability recognized as an important dimension in the agenda. And what you presented about the specific points on legal empowerment, the linkages to SDG 16, show how accountability is important. Not really as something that should be there, but as a smart thing, as you said, in relation to gender equality and accountability in gender terms. So let's now listen to the presentation and the remarks by the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Martin Chungong. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I am very pleased to be participating in this discussion today. I remember when I was approached and asked if I wanted to lend the IPU's name to this event. I jumped at the opportunity and I said, wait, if you start talking about democracy, you're talking about accountability, you're talking about gender equality, then all of these things are in the IPU's DNA. So I jumped at the opportunity, and there can be no more attractive subject for me to discuss than this particular one. And we come to it from the point of view that when we are talking about accountability, especially at the national level, then there is no institution that is better placed to do this than the representative institution of the people, and that is parliaments. They are the people who will ensure, as the SDGs say, that no one is left behind, because parliaments and parliamentarians are supposed to represent every citizen, every inhabitant on any on the territory on which they are functioning. So it is important that we put Parliament firmly in the picture when it comes to talking about accountability. You've made the point, Irene, and Your Excellency Ambassador, you've made the point about the interlinkages between the various goals of the SDG, and that's the beauty of it all, that you cannot pick and choose and say, I'm going to do this and not do this other thing. All of them are linked together, and it is that brings together what we call the coherent whole of the SDGs, which is very important. And when we come to the issue of gender equality, we will see that where there is no gender equality, we stand the less chance of achieving the SDGs as we foresee them, just because of the slogan, leave no one behind. If women are being left behind, then we're not achieving the full potential of development. So I fully subscribe to the interlinked nature of the SDGs and the coordinated and coherent approach that we want to put in place. Again, when we talk about democratic accountability and gender equality, we look at those constraints, those challenges that we need to address. And one you have mentioned, Irene, is discrimination. Women continue to be discriminated. You mentioned this project with UN Women, discrimination in the law. there is evidence that in 90% of the countries in the world today, laws can be found that are still discriminatory against women. So just a small percentage of 10 countries can claim not to be discriminating against women. This is something that we need to tackle if we are talking about democratic accountability. The point has been made, again, that women, when they are at the table, when they participate in decision-making processes, then these processes are enriched, they're more effective, they're more efficient. You mentioned the US Congress. We have seen that when they are empowered economically and socially, then health outcomes improve, education outcomes improve, because women are more likely to invest in this type of endeavor. So it is important, it is in our interest to invest in women's, in gender equality. And how do we do this? For the IPU, it's all well and good to say parliaments should ensure gender equality, but first of all, they have to walk the talk themselves. They have to show that they embody gender equality in the way they function, in the way they are composed. You mentioned representation in parliament. It has slightly improved. It's 23.3% today. But again, if we continue at this pace, it will take 50 years to get to gender parity 50-50, which is not on. And parliaments as an institution have to be seen to be democratic in the way they function. And when we talk about democracy, we're talking parliaments, we're talking of the representative nature of the parliament, the inclusive nature of parliament, and this comes with the inclusion of women in the parliament. So we at the IPU, I was asked to talk about the tools that are being developed to ensure gender equality. We have, for our constituency parliaments, developed what we call the Plan of Action for Gender-Sensitive Parliaments, what it takes for a parliament to be considered to be gender-sensitive. That is, providing opportunities for both men and women to participate in the work of parliament through the structures, through the way they are functioning, through the way they are composed. So we have this that looks at the number of women in parliament, what opportunities are being offered to women, what are the committees they are sitting on, what other facilities such as daycare centers are being made for women to be allowed to participate fully in the work of Parliament. So it is something that we developed 5 years ago, and we're celebrating the 5th anniversary this year. We're hoping that our members can rededicate themselves to that, because if you don't have a gender-sensitive Parliament, then you are not talking of a democratic Parliament. And let me make one point very clear, that it is not enough just to have women in Parliament. The results, the outcomes you mentioned, Irene, about the US Congress having achieved effectiveness in terms of women issues, it did not come just because the women were in Parliament. It came because women were given opportunities in Parliament to perform the work that parliaments are called, or parliamentarians are called upon to do. And that is why we advocate for women to be in Parliament, but also to be in leadership positions in parliaments. Women should be able to hold, why not the Speakership of Parliament? Today we have, I think, just 19% of women holding the post of Speaker of Parliament, which is not good enough. We want to see them in committees. So it is something that if we are addressing gender equality, we need to address women in leadership position in parliaments. Secondly, again, we say that it is not only for women to promote gender equality in parliaments. It is an endeavor that should involve both men and women. Men should be champions of gender equality in parliaments. As somebody was saying yesterday, men should be the flagship of gender equality in parliament. So it's important to reach out to the men, to convince them that this is the right thing to do, for there to be a partnership between the two in working for gender equality. So if I may conclude, because I would like to hear from you and respond to your questions from the floor. We think that a parliament that is the embodiment of democracy itself in any country, a pillar of democracy, is an institution that itself is representative, it's inclusive in the way it functions, it is effective in holding government to account. Governments that are responsible for implementing the commitments that have been taken in the context of the SDGs today, for instance. So it is important that the parliaments be allowed to do that in all independence. We talk about the independence and autonomy of the parliamentary institution, the representative nature of the institution. And once you have that, you also look at how the processes and procedures of parliament are inclusive and representative, not only in terms of Irene being in parliament or the ambassador you being in parliament, but also in terms of the interests that are articulated within parliament, so much so that the cross-section of interests can be dealt with and no one will be left behind. So for me, democratic accountability is inclusion, it is representation, articulating the interests of both men and women. Political and economic empowerment of women is very crucial in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. The role of the Interparliamentary Union in the implementation of the agenda is recognized. I think the partnership that you have also with the UN allows the IPU also to play a proactive role, and you have actually done a lot in collaboration with your own parliaments, and that is something that we can already witness in the high-level political forum process, and that is very, very important for all of us. I would say also that articulating issues about gender equality is something that in parliaments, as we have heard earlier from Irene, also in the field of the fight for judicial reforms, for legal empowerment, is something that existed before the 2030 agenda. Now we have an opportunity to situate it in a world where there is the possibility of building together, joining forces in order to achieve measurable targets. And that will be another aspect probably that we'll address later on today in the conversation. The next speaker is, as I said, a member of the Board of Advisors of IDEA, but she brings also her background as a politician. She is a former member of the European Parliament. So, Emine Bozkurt, you have the opportunity to provide us your views, also based on your experience. So, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tomasoli. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations for reaching total gender equality in this panel. Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen, tiny steps in Guatemala. It is not clear who is gazing at who. We are in a tiny village of the indigenous population in Guatemala. The children are quite lucky that a small school was built with the support of development aid. Boys and girls are looking a bit shy at us, a group of members of European Parliament and our entourage. Interesting that all over the world school classes look the same. I suddenly catch the eye of a little girl with pigtails looking at me. She gives me a big smile. She looks like an 8 years old, but she could be as well 10 years old. Malnutrition is an issue here. On the way to the village, the State Secretary for Nutrition already informed us about the situation of the indigenous population. In the enormous social inequalities in this country, this group is unfortunately at the wrong side. In the past, all their land was taken away. Now they can work at their own land if they pay rent to the landowners. Discrimination, hunger, and violence are part of daily life. This little village has at least some support. The children get food at school. During lunchtime, they are waiting in line for a cup of thin porridge. Not much and not very tasty. For many of them, probably the only meal in a day. 2 girls are smart. They line up again for a refill. Smart girls don't have opportunity in this village. Out of all these children, maybe 3 will have secondary education. We are, of course, talking about boys. School is hardly an option for girls. By the time primary school ends, they might be even pregnant. There are a lot of teenage pregnancies in Guatemala, even from 10 years old. I think of the little girl with the pigtails. How long before she gets pregnant? Outside the school, a group of mothers is waiting. One of them tells that she is 23 years old and mother of 5 children. Another mother tells that she prefers not to have more children. The last one, number 6, was born with a disability. No money for medical treatment. If God wishes, there will be more. Anyway, it is clear that men do wish for more. In this country, more is more. Having many children is a status symbol. A few minutes later, a group of important men will give some presentations. They are representatives of the local community council. Even women's rights are on the agenda. There is a project to raise awareness for women's rights. The women are sitting silent in the room. Some of them are breastfeeding their child. One of them is allowed to stand up. She tells in 2 sentences that there is a project and then sits down again. Of course, I want to hear more about this project and ask a question about the education of girls, saying that economic independence is not only important for girls, but that this will benefit a whole community. I end with the remark that teaching women about their rights without really changing their situation will only lead to make them aware of what they have to miss. The important gentleman gets a bit nervous and quickly says that the project just started. The woman repeats this immediately. At that moment, I realize an important lesson I once learned. If you really want to aim for change in this kind of situations, then complimenting decision makers is far more influential than criticizing them. I swallow and take a deep breath. Yes, indeed, this project is very important. Very good that you set this up. I am convinced that you will be very successful. The man starts to smile again. I think of the little girl with the pigtails. For her generation, it will probably be too late, but maybe for the next generation, maybe. I wrote this column 5 years ago when I was leading a mission to of the European Parliament to Guatemala. In all our efforts to improve life, by legislation, policies, methods, instruments, statistics, debates, we are talking about people, about this little girl. Leaving no one behind, I think, is a real good way to start this work on the SDGs. For that, a people-centered attitude is needed. I'm going to talk about how to push for gender equality in political parties and parliament. You, me, we all know what to do. So many methods, visions, policies. Still, it doesn't pay off as much as we would like to see. Implementation is important. I'm going to look together with you at a few examples of achieving better accountability from politicians and political parties on equal gender representation and how we can help them to achieve the goals of SDG 5. Let me be crystal clear. It all starts with political will, and political will. Luckily, political will is a work in progress and can be influenced. For instance, on the issue of attitude. I remember I was in European Parliament as well, rapporteur on women's rights in Turkey, and we were there in 2005. And our fellow parliamentarians were at that moment thinking that there wasn't much of a problem. They said to me, no, there is not a problem with women's rights because we respect our wives, our daughters, our mothers, our sisters. So why bother? Why do you have to write a report? And I think in a good way of discussing, debating, good cooperation with the Parliament, with the women's rights movement, pressure from the European Parliament, and showing that you have no hidden agenda and have a constructive approach, that attitude changed over years. So later on, the same parliamentarians were saying, yes, it's important that this problem should be solved. Representation, like was said earlier, globally we are around 23% of women consisting of the parliaments in a global way. How can we influence the process? Of course, in elections, female leadership was mentioned, really important. And we have to push for female candidates, support them. That's an issue. Give proper political education and look at the election lists of parties, sometimes even also election law, which should be changed. And of course, we should not forget to vote for women. On the issue of quota, I am in favor of quota because, like Mrs. Khan said, if we really go in this space, 2080 will be the year where we can reach it. If we look at this picture, this is my own country, the Netherlands, and this is the government Rutte 1. It's 2 governments ago. But what you see is a lot of white men and 3 women. The 4th one is not member of the cabinet, that's our former queen. So she doesn't count in the gender equality balance. The other picture, is the cabinet of Mr. Justin Trudeau in Canada. And what we see here is a far more diverse government. And what looks better? Let's be honest. I think the second one looks much, much better because it's a fair representation and we're talking about democracy. And in democracy, no one should be left behind. People should be represented. So, yeah, if we impose quota in the countries, we could be far before 2080, we could reach gender equality. So why not aim for 2020? I think we have something to wish for. It's important to explain why it's we should vote for parties. And of course, an important group are the women. And parties should represent their interest. Talking about their interest, I can think of things which should show up in a manifesto and in the party programs. Provide safe access to sexual health services, fight against poverty, equal pay for equal work, closing the pay gap, fight for parental leave, fight for the access to education, social rights, pensions, combat discrimination, multiple discrimination of elderly, disabled and migrant women. There are many ways to influence the process, but one of them is mainstream gender equality in all policy areas. And when I'm talking about gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting, it's not something which should be done at the end of the process. No, you should start right away with thinking about how to achieve gender equality in all walks of policy and life. Once elected, not only women are created to do the work in the Committee of Women's Rights and Gender Equality. In the European Parliament we saw that there were maybe 1 or 2 men part of that committee and the rest are women. That should change. We need also gender equality and in this more men and committees working on that issue, because it's not only about women and girls, it's also about boys and men. It's a joint effort. Talking about the parliamentary work, gender equality should have a more prominent place in it. I also want to mention this to my colleague because gender equality, nobody says, basically, apart from some obscure parties, that they are against gender equality. But in fact, it's sometimes a topic which is not very much among the priorities of a lot of parties. When we looked at the meeting yesterday, and it's only, of course, a snapshot, there was not so much talked about SDG 5, which is, in the end, an overarching theme. So, more gender equality also here in the meetings. Participation of civil society, inclusive approach is important. They are our partners, political parties, politicians. We need them to share information, best practices, challenges, and we have to work together. To give you an example how it sometimes not works is the anti-discrimination directive we were working on, the horizontal in the European Parliament. And the organizations in Brussels, the international organizations, were doing excellent work. But on the national level, where governments, some governments, and like my own government, also Germany, were against this directive because of the money, there was no real coordination between, for instance, organizations working on discrimination of people with a disability within the countries. And that worked against us, because if they would have asked their own government, what are you doing for us in Brussels, then I think it would have made a change. And it's still on the shelf because governments don't want to have it, most of them. Last one, information gap. Talking about European Parliament, of course there are a lot of other parliaments, maybe with a different situation, but everything which is done in the Parliament is online, on social media, whatever you want, so much information, reports, parliamentary questions, debates, videos, amendments, what you voted, you name it. Even organizations are monitoring for the citizens what politicians are voting, whether they follow their political group or what they do with your tax dollars or euros. So much information, but so few people are aware of it. In the end, only the specialized organizations, NGOs or lobby organizations, are the ones that follow these media, which is a pity, because if you're talking about accountability, you have to know what they do. And the information is there, but it should be disclosed. So there are so many ways to ask your representatives, your party, for transparency, accountability through all those medias. Let me make some commercial break on the policy brief of IDEA about accountability in the post-2015 development agenda. So we have the SDGs, we have a date, 2030. In a way, that looks quite far away. On the other hand, it will be very soon. There's a lot of work to do, and like I said before, implementation is crucial. I sincerely hope that the high-level political forum not only stands for the job description, but as well for the level of ambitions. So we can help create a more equal world in which a little girl with the pigtails and someone is going to push a button. This is your cue. So we can help to create a more equal world in which a little girl with the pigtails can grow up to become... You don't have the picture? Sorry, I didn't get it. Okay, so I had a picture of the girl actually, and I want to show it. But I hope that she can become the first female president of Guatemala. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emine. I think you summarized very well, just at the beginning, the issues that have been addressed, because you said that you have been in the Parliament putting a lot of efforts to improve life by legislation, policies, methods, statistics, and debates. And all of this is actually what has been covered by the various speakers, and it is also what is being addressed in the high-level political forum. You also mentioned this information gap, ironically from the point of view of where the information is available, and you need some direction in order to dig it out. The information gap is also in the other direction, when the information is not available and you need to build the capacities to create the database and then to use it. So many points for discussion and debate. I hope that there will be questions and interaction from the floor. So I'm opening it up to anybody who would like to talk. We will have slightly more than half an hour for these conversations. So anybody wishing to pose questions or make comments to our speakers? I have somebody from the back. Please identify yourself.
I'm Dave Dunlop with the National Space Society. And one thing I was rather disappointed in is not hearing more of an economic strategy. You know, I think that women should have their own money. And I think if you want to have equal rights, then that the foundation of it is often economic. And if you have the ability to earn income and to have economic power, that then transforms the society as well as the politics. So I think that's an area that is deserving of a major part of the strategy. So, you know, even at the micro lending, it's often women who are the entrepreneurs and who get ideas and bring new ideas to the marketplace. And their ability to function in the marketplace, the rights to conduct business, to own money, to have property rights, the legal framework has to be there. But I think that is a real major on the ground way of affecting how rapid change can occur.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. It's about rights in a way, but in a different perspective. So are there other points people want to make? Yes, we have two people here.
Hi, my name's Dominique. I'm from the Centre of Defence and Security Studies. My question is, at what stage does the quota or the presence of the ideas become more important? The politics of ideas over presence. So when is it more important that it's 50-50 female-male? So when can women stop having to be the ones to talk about gender issues? Like when does the onus get taken away from the woman to have to bring those issues up? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ryan Adele. I'm from the Temple of Understanding, and I just wanted to ask the panel to address the digital divide between men and women. So in developing countries, for example, many women don't have access to the internet, and the internet is a tool that could really empower them and open them up to the world, especially in countries where internet access is limited. It sometimes can be exclusively available to men. So I would like the panel to address that. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Eunice Park, and we're both high school interns for the Temple of Understanding. And forgive me if I'm not so educated on this topic, but you guys mentioned a lot about the legal ramifications and importance of imposing, first of all, legal policy to make sure there is strong policy. So I was attending an event last week and where the representative of Zambia talked a lot about how in her country there's been a lot of problems between statutory and customary law. So I was wondering if you could possibly address the fact of these different types of laws or these different social conditions that make it difficult for this legal policy to go into action and how we could combat that in the future. Thank you so much.
Good. If there are no other questions, yeah, there is one from the back there.
Hello, I'm Abraham Joseph. I'm a former senior advisor at the United Nations and now with the University of Oklahoma. In fact, I'd like to mention about rural women. This issue is having been also posted in various countries. I've seen that rural women are not being focused on. If you really look, there's need for more capacities to be built, especially in providing them employment, training, and so on and so forth. And even if when we look at resources that are flowing from outside, the focus more is on urban, women, especially to the NGOs over there. So there is need for, I would like to mention that we should try to help the urban women NGOs to assist the rural women NGOs. I mean, this is more effective rather than what you call foreign NGOs coming to the rural areas. This has been my experience having worked in some of the developing countries. Thank you.
We have more from the right here. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Marjorie Berman. I'm with Planned Parenthood Global. Thank you all for your comments. And Ms. Burkhart, your comments really particularly resonated with me as you spoke of the potential for pregnancy to derail a girl's future. And knowing that Guttmacher and many others have shown that family planning can form a foundation for women and girls' education, economic empowerment, and ultimately gender equality, how do you approach legislation in various countries that suppress family planning and comprehensive sexuality education?
Mm-hmm. Here from the back. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Honorable Dauda Kalon, and I come from Sierra Leone Parliament. I'm the focal point for Sustainable Development Goal Action Group in the House of Parliament. My question has to do with the issue of the women's empowerment. Most often, there's this huge campaign about empowering women, especially women in politics, having to be women in elective position. But then when once these women are being elected into elective positions, for instance, they are in parliaments, and then that's it. That's the end of the support. And then the communities, the people, comes bashing at these women because they are not capacitated for that to be able to implement their responsibility. How can we address such an issue? Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Dr. Naima Chaplin. I am President International Federation Collaboration. First of all, thank you to organize this really very important panel discussion and for all your comments. My point is women's economic empower, because if United Nations agency and organization will focus how it's reflected for all society, because when it's going on unpaid job or women have no access to justice, even there is a lot of law, but practically women really have no access for all of this one to get benefits of the rule of law. And my point is how you can consider UN and your organization can be more involved to address all these issues, economic empower, and how it's reflected for all society. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So if there are no other questions at this stage, we may come back for some more questions before closing. I would get back to the panel. Maybe we could go in the reverse order of speakers. So I would start with Emine. You had a question specifically addressed to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to make two remarks. But let me start with the question directed to Mrs. Berman. My name is Boskurt, by the way. It's what you said is sadly true, that in a lot of countries where there are problems with access to reproductive health and reproductive rights, a lot of women simply die because they are getting pregnant at a very young age or have problems. And I think I can speak the best from my experience in the European Parliament. It helps to put pressure on those countries when you have a relation on the issue of development aid, or you can, when you are, I saw that, for instance, when there was negotiations on association agreements, those are the moments where you can talk and where you have leverage to talk, but also by supporting, of course, NGOs working, and in very much of the cases, very brave women advocating those issues in difficult situations, but they need our support. And I'm also proud that in my country, our Minister of Development and Trade took the initiative when the United States were cutting all those funds to establish a fund. She decides to help a lot of organizations, especially on these issues. So, and we really have to see what we can do in coordination and take responsibility to help women. We don't want women to die. Oh, yeah, and the issue of the economic power, I totally agree with you. I mentioned it a little bit in my column that economic independence is key for women. What I saw, for instance, in the situation when I was a rapporteur on women's rights in Turkey, in the fight against violence against women, there was many times there were the cases that women were sent home again by the police, and a lot of women couldn't leave an abusive husband because they didn't have their own money. They didn't have a place where to go. So it's crucial in issues of violence, but also because you want to be in charge of your own life. So I totally agree with you, and also with the last question, which was of the same topic.
Yes, Martin.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I agree also that it is important that political empowerment come with economic empowerment, financial inclusion of women. You may have the best regulatory framework, you may have the best laws, but if women don't have access to financial resources, they cannot begin to make a difference. So I agree with you entirely. Then the question regarding the onus on women when it comes to gender equality, when should this be lifted? I would say yesterday. It should not exist. The onus should not be on women to promote gender equality. Gender equality is not a women's issue. I think it's clear. It is an issue that concerns both men and women, and it is incumbent on men and women to work together to promote gender equality, or to do away with gender inequality. So today it happens that we are trying to promote women's rights because when we look at the status of the two sexes in society today, it's the women that are disadvantaged, and so we're trying to level the playing field so that both sexes can enjoy the same status and rights in society. So it's something that we need to work together on. I give you an example. In Rwanda, they have what they call a caucus, or a forum of women parliamentarians. But the name is a misnomer because within that caucus, within that network, you have men parliamentarians that are members, full-fledged members. So it's a multi-sex endeavor. The issue of conflict between customary and statutory law, modern law, I think that this should not be a pretext for suppressing women's rights. If we are looking at gender equality as an issue of human rights, then anything in law, whether it is customary or modern law, that tampers with the rights of one sex should not be allowed to happen. I think it is very clear. So let's take a simple example. In some traditional societies in Africa, they say women shouldn't eat eggs, right? Why should it be that way? When both men and women have the same needs, health needs, nutritional needs, eggs are not different for women than for men. So it is, in that case, inexcusable that can be used to suppress the rights of women. The point about supporting women parliamentarians, yes, it is a reality that there are lots of expectations when women are voted into office. it's like they were doing them a favor, saying, okay, now that you are member of parliament, you have arrived. But no, why should that be different from, between a man and a woman parliamentarian? So when you talk about capacity building, capacitation, it should apply to both men and women. But we do understand that in some cases women are disadvantaged for a number of structural reasons, cultural reasons, and so more emphasis has to be laid. We at the IPU provide such support to women parliamentarians. I think we're doing that in Sierra Leone. To the caucus of women parliamentarians in Sierra Leone, we're supporting that caucus to articulate issues that are specific to women. But our general policy is to provide across the board capacity building for parliaments. Let me go back to something that I wanted to mention, which is a major impediment that we have identified to promoting gender equality, especially political empowerment of women. And it is violence against women, violence against especially women parliamentarians or politicians. We saw that last year when we did a survey and realized that this phenomenon is more prevalent than we have thought. It's just that it has been swept under the carpet because women politicians are supposed to be the elite in society, and you would think that they would enjoy all the benefits and privileges in society. But they themselves, I think we found that 81% of women parliamentarians had reported some form of violence or discriminatory practices against them. So if we are talking about democratic accountability, then we should be looking at the rights of members of parliament. They have to have their rights protected, especially the women, for them to be able to promote gender equality. I thought I should bring that point because we didn't make a lot of we didn't say a lot about gender-based violence in this meeting. And by the way, when you talk about financial empowerment of women, then that takes you to what we need to do to promote gender-responsive budgeting, to make sure that budgets are responsive to the varied needs of men and women in a similar fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Actually, the point on violence is very relevant. If you look at the targets and the indicators that exist now in the 2030 agenda, there is only a generic definition of gender-based violence. But in fact, it is true what you're saying. There is a specific dimension which is political violence based on gender. And in some regions, they are also trying to address it from a legislative point of view. For example, in Latin America, they developed at the regional level a template for a bill addressing political violence. And I think that would be very interesting in perspective if it could be further developed also in other regions. Sorry for taking some time on this, but Irene, you had also various questions on the legal pluralism, the element again on women's access to justice. So I'm confident you have many things to say.
Thank you. Let me start with the issue of economic empowerment. I did mention the issue of women's access to land, because access to land, to property, to assets of any type is absolutely essential if we're looking for gender equality. I come from Bangladesh, the country where microcredit, as you know, changed the scene for women, women's access to microcredit. So I think the whole issue of economic empowerment is very closely linked to legal empowerment, because very often it is about ensuring that the access that women have to assets is translated into property that they own, over which they can have the authority to dispose or keep. And economic empowerment sometimes, very often actually leads to political empowerment rather than the other way around, because no one gives up power willingly. It is when women get economic power that they begin to be respected, they begin to have a voice in their families and in their communities and so on. So this is absolutely a vital point to make. Now, I moved from there to the issue of informal and formal, because very often women's economic power, women's economic property is in the informal domain rather than the formal domain. And one needs to push it into the formal domain. But when it comes to informal justice systems, we need to be extremely careful. And I say that as a qualified lawyer, that we do not come with arrogance, believing that the formal legal system actually provides women protection, more protection than informal legal systems. My organization, IDLO, did a study of 9 situations in 9 different parts of the world, looking at women's access to justice under formal and informal, and see what do women access. And we discovered that women don't have a preference of one over the other. They will access justice that is most accessible, most understandable, and most affordable. And usually that tends to be the informal system. And so there are characteristics in the informal system that we need to value. There are also, of course, a lot of discriminatory elements in these informal systems. But we need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we have found that where especially colonial powers have come in and have codified informal systems, they have created huge problems, because the whole concept of the informal system is that it should evolve over time. So if you work from within the community, then over time, as women gain more political power, they actually change the informal systems. And our case studies have shown that happening. We have a case study, for example, in Namibia, where that happened. So this is a very complicated issue, but one message for the development practitioners should be, do no harm. Don't barge in and think that you have an answer from somewhere else that you can impose. You have to understand the community, you have to work with them from within, and engage with them and ensure that change comes in that way. I think we talked about, I think no one talked about the digital divide that I think you raised. And again, you see internet access is an asset. It's knowledge, it's power, it's information. And so there needs to be a conscious policy decision about closing that digital divide. But what is, of course, happening is not so much internet access, it's actually mobile technology that is allowing many, many developing countries to leapfrog into the future. And I think we tend, the digital divide may actually be less wide than we believe it is, especially as women gain economic power. I have been to slums, for example, the slum of Kibera in Nairobi, the largest slum in the world, where about 1 million people are living. Very poor conditions. But what I found that just about every woman had a mobile phone inside her dress. And she would pull it out because that gave her access. And it was cheap. It was cheap. Mobile technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So it's a very easy thing. And there's lots of very innovative work that is being done using mobile technology and virtual systems to promote development. So that's a very important point you have made. The issue about onus, when does the onus shift? You know, when I was head of Amnesty International, we launched a campaign to stop violence against women. And what really impressed me about that campaign were the number of men who signed on. There was one event where Amnesty symbol was to dip your hand in paint and put it on a blank canvas. And there was one event I remember where the campaign was launched, there was a huge audience there, and one young man came running through the audience, dipped his hand on the paint, put it on the canvas and said, "For my mother." So very often, men, we forget, men are brothers, sons, fathers, husbands, and it's through that engagement that one should engage and bring men in rather than making them feel as though they are the culprits, they are the bad guys. But having said that, we need to recognize that we're not talking about single men, we're talking about a feminist structure or a masculine structure. Feminism is not about women, it's about a way of thinking, it's a way of approach to it. So when Canada or Sweden talk about a feminist government, it's not about women, it's about a way of thinking, of equality and diversity and inclusion, and that's what we should be promoting. Then I think there was a question about sexual and reproductive rights. Now, in my country, in Bangladesh, the birth rate now is lower than in India. And it wasn't it was achieved through multiple ways. I think sexual and reproductive right is most successful when it is accompanied with education, health programs, economic programs. What brings birth rates down is girls going to school and staying in school. Stipends to young girls in high schools in my country help to bring down or rather raise the age of marriage. But the government now has introduced legislation which is actually encourages marriages below the age of 18, which is, counterproductive. So put girls in school, give them jobs, empower them, and you will and provide them with access to sexual and reproductive health, and they will use that access to actually improve their own lives as well as society. Let me now end with a personal anecdote. I said I come from Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, since the mid-90s, all our major political parties are led by women. So we have prime ministers, female, leaders of opposition, female. I'm not talking about the quality of politics in Bangladesh, I'm talking about female leadership. I have a young nephew who a few years ago, was about 5 years old at that time. A few years ago we had elections and he was sitting in front of television and he was watching the leader of the opposition party making a big demo, rally, giving speeches. Then he watched the prime minister, another woman, come up and make speeches. And he watched this very seriously whole evening. And then when his mother was putting him to bed, he said to her, "Mummy, when little boys grow up, can they be prime minister too?" So you see, it's all about changing attitudes and looking with a different lens. And eventually, I think we will get there. But it will be a long, hard fight. I think the 2030 agenda gives us an opportunity, as nothing else, for an integrated approach to make things happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you. We have still one question that was posed by Abraham, quite interesting, I would say, about another divide, which is the rural-urban divide. You refer to the NGOs and the capacity building and the gap that exists, but you made also a point about dialogue between local NGOs rather than the role of international NGOs providing capacitating roles and functions in that respect. Is there anybody from the panel who would like to address this question? It is interesting that in the SDGs, the SDG that deals with the local governance is actually about cities, if I remember well. But there is also a dimension of local governance at the rural level, and I think this question is also related to that. Irene, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to say that actually if you look at development policy and take a look over the last 20 to 30 years, there has been more emphasis on rural development than on urban development. Cities are very visible. You arrive in a city and you see the slums, but actually when you look at it, a lot of development aid doesn't go into the slums. It actually goes the other way around into rural areas. But whether it is being used properly in the rural areas to connect people properly is another matter. I think the point that I took from your question was first about intersectionality. We talk about women as though they're all a homogeneous group. It is not that at all. The difference between me and my compatriot who's living in a distant village or in a slum in Bangladesh is huge. I have more in common with all of you than with my compatriots of that class back home. So whenever we're talking about development, we need to keep in mind that leaving no one behind means a greater sensitivity to looking at different categories of people. And with rural women, we have found in our business of access to justice that remoteness of the courts, remoteness of the laws, their vulnerability in communities is much, much higher because they're so far away from all these institutions. So they do require a different approach, different types of strategies to address their needs. When it comes to discussions among local NGOs, there is, I think, greater possibilities now, partly because of technology. I think technology is making it much, much easier to interact, to mobilize, bring people together in many of these situations. And I think technology is going to be a great enabler, possibly the single most important enabler for the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, closing this rural-urban divide. I know that the business about local NGOs working with each other, you mentioned about urban NGOs reaching out to rural ones, but I think, we find that where successful development is taking place on the ground, it is usually by mobilizing the communities. It is not by urban people going to the villages and telling the villagers how to solve their problems, but finding ways in which villagers can sit around, find their answers, and seek and get the resources they need. I think it is much more this ability of people to mobilize among themselves, of communities to talk, of co-creating solutions, their own solutions. That's really the successful path we find in practice.
Thank you, Irene. I think we don't have much time. Do you want to say something quickly?
Yes, quickly I want to mention that I was posted in East Timor, Timor-Leste, and there, we found, for example, the rural women, they were not aware about human rights. They were not aware about various about gender violence issues and all that, and we were able to help the urban NGOs to reach out to the rural NGOs, to train them, to know what their rights are. And also that's not the only thing, about nutrition. For example, in some of the villages, we find that there are various vegetables and all that, but they don't take those items which are very important, especially for women. So the urban women were able to go there, reach out, and train them, even in cooking those vegetables and making them taste those nutritious food. So what I'm saying is that urban NGOs, if we could help the urban NGOs to reach out to the rural NGOs, it could help a lot. I would like to say, because in Timor-Leste we have seen this experience. And one more last thing I just want to mention is about when we talk of gender equality and gender violence, there is need for training even young children at the school level, because in Timor-Leste again, I would like to say that in the school curriculum, boys and girls, they have been taught also about human rights. So this has been inculcated in the schools. So I just want to make a mention of this, which is very important. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that point. Maybe last word to Emin, who wanted to say something also on this.
Yeah.
Quickly.
I will do it quickly. No, but let's not also forget about old technology, which is the television. A lot of distant villages, there are televisions and programs about women's rights, but also health and that kind of stuff are important. Women learn from that. So don't underestimate also the power of old technology. The second thing I want to mention on the issue of women in agriculture, in villages and rural areas is there was once, for instance, a project in Turkey, and a women's organization who were teaching women about their rights. And two of the things I want to mention, one of the things was a situation with a girl who was going to be, married to someone she didn't want. But she didn't know about the situation that it's forbidden by law to be forced into marriage. And then she used that knowledge, which she learned at that course, by saying to her parents, okay, if you really force me, I will marry, but then I will go to the judge and then dissolve the marriage. If that's what you want, we can do it like that, because I know my rights. And that was, for the parents, a trigger to change their minds, because that's also not what they want. So For women to know their rights, it's important. We should support those kind of projects. And the other example I wanted to tell about is in one of those villages, and villages are, of course, in many cases, a very closed community which works negatively, but sometimes also positively. One of the women was not anymore allowed to go to the course. And at that moment, the other women came to the house, took the woman and said to the husband, we are taking her and she is going to the course. And then it was allowed. So it can also work in a positive way, the pressure of the community, the social control.
Thank you very much, Emin. I think we can come to a conclusion, to a closing. I really appreciated your contributions and your time. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that implementation requires also monitoring progress. So if you consider how many indicators are accepted and there is a methodology and there are enough data, I must say that SDGs 5 on gender equality is one of those lagging behind, because there is only, out of the indicators identified for the SDG 5, which are about 15, only 20% of them are approved, there are data, and they have a methodology. So there is a need to grow also, to go ahead more quickly on that in order to address this information gap, this data gap, and there is a role for all actors represented at this table to play. So definitely a role for member states. They are leading this process. This is a national effort. There is a leadership role, especially in like-minded countries that attach great priority to this. There is an important role also for parliaments as key actors in this endeavor in order for this to be a country-owned and not simply an executive-owned process. There is a role for international organizations, especially those with an explicit and unique mandate on the rule of law like IDLO. There is a role for politicians, political parties, activists, and experts. And I'm very proud to have had our board member from IDEA here at the table. There is a role for NGOs and civil society specialists, UN officers, UN experts, and I do hope that in a few years from now, maybe 2019, when there will be the review of SDG 16, we'll be able to show how long have we gone on this path and what we can show in terms of impact on the agenda. Thank you very much. There is some coffee in the back of the room if you want to have some coffee, and thank you again for your participation.
Thank you for moderating.
Gracias, Gustavo. 5 minutos. No te preocupes, no te preocupes.